Good afternoon. I'm Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Erin Campbell. With me today are State Economist Dr. Tony Becker and State Budget Director Ahna Minge. Together, we will present the November 2025 Budget and Economic Forecast. I want to begin by acknowledging the hard work performed by Dr. Becker and the Economic Analysis team. I also want to thank Ahna Minge and the Budget team for their work in developing the Budget Outlook, as well as other staff at MMB and our partner agencies who provided the information necessary to prepare our budget forecast. As a reminder, Minnesota is one of 13 states that show a 4-year window into our state's budget and economic outlook in our twice-yearly forecasts. That enables us to not only gauge near-term economic conditions, but also to plan for circumstances that may arise in the next biennium. We analyze a large amount of data to develop our forecasts, and the forecasts represent the best financial projections that we can provide based on the information available when we prepare them. In this forecast, we continue to refine our projections for budget years FY26 and 27, which policymakers can use in their supplemental budget considerations. We also update our projections for the planning years FY28 and 29. After our presentation, we'll be happy to take your questions. Getting into the forecast specifics, we now project a budget surplus of nearly $2.5 billion at the end of the current 26-27 biennium, and that is $575 million more than our end of session estimate. Left unspent, the surplus carries over into the planning years, helping to reduce the projected negative balance in the next biennium. Speaking of the next biennium, we now project a negative balance of $2.9 billion in FY28-29. This is about $1.8 billion worse than the end of session, and that's driven by a worsening structural imbalance. You'll recall when I stood before you 9 months ago, we were forecasting a $6 billion negative balance for those planning years. The governor and legislature made significant progress last legislative session in reducing the projected negative balance. Thanks to their leadership, we are in a stronger place to respond to a more challenging budget situation. Clearly, there's more work to do to address the projected negative balance, but I do want to acknowledge the decisive actions taken by the governor and legislators earlier this year. They made a material and positive difference in our budget outlook. As you can see on the slide, we're projecting higher income tax collections in the near term, but slower economic growth will limit tax collections into the next biennium. At the same time, significant increases in healthcare costs increase forecast spending, putting more pressure on our efforts to achieve a structural balance. Our budget reserve now stands at $3.4 billion. The reserve helps ensure that if there's an unexpected drop in revenues in the current biennium, that we'll have some cushion to address it. It minimizes the need for large immediate cuts. This reserve, the healthy reserve, also helps strengthen our credit ratings. This slide shows a projected FY26-27 budgetary balance for this forecast in the middle column compared to the end of session estimates on the left. The column furthest to the right shows the difference between the two. At the top of the slide, you'll see that our beginning balance for the current biennium is nearly $10.3 billion, $2.8 billion more than our end of session estimate. If you remove the $1.9 billion in carry forward from that forecast change, the actual increase from end of session estimates to our November forecast is $949 million. Our revenue estimates are up about $1.4 billion from end of session, and spending net of carry forward is up about $1.6 billion. You'll note in both end of session estimates and our current forecast that we project spending will outpace revenues during this current biennium and the next, reflecting a growing structural imbalance. We've added $244 million to our budget reserve, bringing total cash flow and budget reserves to $3.8 billion. The projected balance at the end of fiscal years 26 and 27 appears under the lowest horizontal line. As you can see, we now forecast a positive balance of nearly $2.5 billion in FY26 and 27. This slide shows the forecast horizon. Let's start with the column in dark blue furthest to the left on the slide. This shows the $4.9 billion that remained unspent at the end of fiscal years 24 and 25. That then carried forward to become the beginning balance for FY26 and 27. If we move to the teal column, you can see that $4.9 billion beginning balance is reduced by the size of our projected structural imbalance. or $2.4 billion. That represents the amount that our spending in FY 26-27 is expected to exceed our revenues collected. When we move to the dark blue middle column, you can see what we project to have left at the end of the current biennium after we've subtracted the projected structural imbalance. The remainder, $2.5 billion, will carry over to the start of FY 28-29. Moving to the column on the right, we see in yellow what happens when we subtract the projected structural imbalance in FY 28 and 29, which now totals $4.5 billion, plus the $935 million in discretionary inflation, and we take that off of the $2.5 billion beginning balance. We end up with what you see on the far right, a projected negative balance of nearly $3 billion in the planning biennium. If we were to not count discretionary inflation, which as a reminder, legislators are not required to budget for, we'd have a projected negative balance of slightly over $2 billion. Constitutionally and statutorily, Minnesota is required to enact a balanced budget for the current biennium, and we just did that, and clearly we've got a projected positive balance. But as you can see, spending decisions made this legislative session will have impacts on the planning years, where we anticipate still significant but manageable challenges. The legislature can address those challenges by continuing the work undertaken last legislative session to bring projected spending more in line with anticipated resources. With that, I'd like to invite State Economist Dr. Becker to the podium to cover the economic and revenue outlook.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. I'm Anthony Becker, Minnesota State Economist, and since Minnesota's budget and economic forecast was last prepared in February of 25, the U.S. economic outlook has seen minor revisions through the forecast horizon of 2029. Our macroeconomic consultants, S&P Global Market Intelligence, or SPGMI, released their baseline forecast to us on November 5th of 2025. In it, they assumed the federal shutdown would last 6 weeks, so they were only off by 1 day. They assume further easing of monetary conditions with the Federal Reserve lowering the federal funds rate target one more time this year and twice in 2026. They also assume that the effective tariff rate will be 18% and that tariffs will only fall slowly over our forecast horizon. They make no prediction about the Supreme Court's action on the tariff case before it, except to note that overturning the tariffs would lower the effective rate to approximately 9%. Finally, they assume that net migration to the U.S. will be 500,000 persons per year lower than the Census Bureau had in its population projections. In this chart, we have SPGMI's forecast for GDP growth through the end of the forecast period. The overall rate of growth rate of the economy does not show much change from February. There's slightly lower growth in 25, slightly higher in 26, mostly due to the low GDP growth in the first quarter of 25 and the shutdown, which SPGMI assumes will shift some final demand to 2026. As in February, GDP growth remains what we call below trend in 2027 and beyond. This means that employment demand is unlikely to be robust in the years ahead. Further, a low-growth economy can more easily slip into recession as the result of an adverse external shock. Real personal consumption expenditures, also referred to as real consumer spending, are a primary driver of growth in the economy, accounting for roughly 70% of gross domestic product. SPGMI now forecasts real consumer spending to grow 2.5% in 2025, 0.6 percentage points lower than their February 25 forecast. From 26 through 29, real consumer spending is expected to grow at 2.1% per year on average. This downward revision is a key factor contributing to the below-trend GDP growth projected over the forecast period. The low consumer expenditure forecast may be related to low consumer sentiment, which in turn may reflect uncertainty about inflation or unemployment prospects. It may also be related to increasing financial stress of households, as evidenced by recent increases in delinquency rates for many categories of loans. Private investment is forecast to experience historically low rates of growth through the forecast period, further suppressing overall economic growth. SPGMI forecasts that real non-residential or business fixed investment will grow at a rate of less than 2% per year in 2026 through 28. As private investment is about 18% of GDP, the low investment growth rate will be a short-term drag on GDP growth. Further, investment is necessary to build the capital base for production in the long run. In this forecast, the rate of inflation is not expected to be substantially different than that in SPGMI's earlier forecast. They now project CPI inflation will remain close to 3% through 2026, before falling below 2.6% in 27 through the end of the forecast period. SPGMI forecasts a roughly 12% downward correction in the S&P 500, with the market peaking in the fourth quarter of 2025 and declining through late 2028, when a gradual recovery is expected to begin. The accompanying graph compares the current forecast for the S&P 500 to the February 25 forecast. Many macroeconomic forecasters have been expecting a correction in equity markets for years, a correction that has yet to materialize. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks to this forecast. Households in the top quintile of income distribution hold a high proportion of the equities held by all U.S. households, and they account for over 1/3 of personal consumption expenditure. A downward correction in equity markets could cause outsized changes in personal consumption. Alternatively, continued growth in equity values could continue to support consumption and so present a possible upside risk as well. After a robust expansion in payroll employment following the COVID pandemic, recent job growth has slowed markedly. And SPGMI's forecast is for continued low rates of job creation through the forecast horizon. They forecast employment growth in 2025 will average 125,000 jobs per month. However, beyond 2025, employment growth is forecasted to slow significantly to roughly 35,000 jobs per month through the end of the forecast period. The lower level of projected job growth in this forecast reflects the changing demographics of the U.S. potential labor force, caused by an aging population and lower birth rates. Demographics, coupled with lower projected levels of immigration, further constrain potential employment growth. With only moderate growth in Minnesota employment expected in this forecast, increases in wage and salary income per worker will be the primary driver of growth in total wage and salary disbursements through the forecast horizon, rather than increases in the number of workers driving it. The lower forecast for wages per worker reflects revision in underlying variables and lower observed wage growth since February. Nonetheless, we still expect nominal wage growth will exceed the rate of inflation in Minnesota, which will raise real wages per worker and workers' purchasing power. Now to go to forecast risks. First and foremost among the risks to this forecast are the policy uncertainties at the federal level, especially regarding trade, tariffs, and immigration. Numerous trade deals have been announced, but few details have been made official, creating uncertainty about the nature, scope, and durability of the agreements. Trade uncertainty may induce businesses and consumers to take on less debt, suppressing both private investment and some forms of consumer spending. The administration's immigration policies also produce forecast risk through potential to create labor shortages in business sectors dependent on immigration for new workers. Disruptions from federal agency closures and contract suspensions and the effects of the recent shutdown create fiscal risks, as Congress may or may not restore funding and the administration may or may not reverse some cuts. The recent federal shutdown disrupted the usual collection and dissemination of federal statistical data, particularly economic data published by the Labor and Commerce Departments, including data on employment and labor, GDP and national income accounts, and price indices. The missing data due to the shutdown also clouds our picture of both inflation and labor market conditions, making it more difficult for us to assess the reasonableness of SPGMI's monetary policy assumptions. Equity markets, as I've already mentioned, present both upside and downside risks. And as always, There are 20 months remaining until the end of the current biennium, and it is difficult to forecast macroeconomic conditions with great precision more than a year and a half ahead. Moving to the revenue forecast. The first two columns of the table show the November forecast for the current biennium and the change compared to the end of session forecast. The second set of columns shows the November forecast for the next biennium and the change since end of session. Total revenues for the next biennium are now forecast to be $66.3 billion, 2.2% more than at end of session. Higher forecasts for individual income tax and other revenue more than offset slightly lower forecasts for sales and corporate taxes. We're now projecting individual income tax receipts to be 4.6% more than we projected earlier. This increase is mostly driven by a higher estimate for tax year 2024 liability and is consistent with the higher than forecast income tax payments and lower refunds for tax year 24, which we detailed in our July 2025 revenue and economic update. We estimate tax year 24 income tax liability is higher largely because capital gains, interest, and dividend income grew more than we previously assumed they would. Much of the higher tax liability carries forward into tax years 25 and 26, increasing the revenue forecast for the current biennium. Sales tax revenue is now forecast to be 2.1% less than in the current biennium than in our prior estimate. Our decreased forecast in gross sales tax receipts reflects weaker than expected collections since end of session and a lower forecast for consumer spending on goods and services subject to the sales tax. The corporate franchise tax is forecast to generate $6.2 billion, or about 1% less revenue than we forecast at end of session. As we've reported in our monthly updates, corporate tax receipts are running well below our end of session estimates due to lower estimated payments and from lower underlying tax year 25 liability. Corporations may be responding to recent changes in federal tax law, but nonetheless, because Minnesota is not an automatically complying state, we expect some of this shortfall to be offset by higher final payments in the spring of 2026. Other revenues are now forecasted to generate $9.7 billion, or 3.4% more than we previously forecast, primarily due to an increase forecast for investment income, the return the state earns on its cash balances, including the budget reserve. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to the State Budget Director, Ahna Minge.
Thank you, Dr. Becker, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ahna Minge, State Budget Director with Minnesota Management and Budget, and I'm going to walk through changes in the state's spending forecast and then turn it over to the Commissioner, who will present on the state's long-term budget outlook. So the slide in front of you today shows anticipated spending changes in the general fund in the current biennium, which is 26-27, as well as the upcoming planning years of 2028 and 29. If you look at the very bottom, you can see that total spending in the current biennium is projected to reach $70.3 billion, a $3.4 billion increase relative to end of session, and the planning estimates have increased by $1.9 billion. However, when we isolate true changes in state program spending, the increases, though significant, are smaller. After adjusting for carry forward and discretionary inflation, forecast spending, if you look at the baseline spending line, is $1.6 billion, which is 2.3% higher in the current biennium, and $1.7 billion, or 2.6% higher in the planning estimates. Let me walk you through the table to describe what's driving this change. So the first line, E12 education, is $115 million higher in the first biennium and $288 million higher in the second, compared to where we were at the end of session. These increases are primarily driven by higher projected spending for special education. We have seen in recent months districts spending additional money to provide special education services due to both increases in pupils as well as higher costs for staff salaries and benefits. The next line, Health and Human Services spending, is about $1.4 billion higher than previous estimates in the current biennium and the next. This is clearly the largest change from previous forecasts on the spending side, and about 90% of it is due to changes in the state's medical assistance program. I'll talk about those changes in greater detail in a following slide, but let's just walk through the rest of the changes here first. So you can see property tax aids and credits spending is also above previous estimates by $84 million in the first biennium and $116 million in the planning years. This is driven by higher property tax refunds. The next line's debt service on state-issued bonds is below previous estimates, primarily as a result of a smaller than anticipated bond sale and lower interest rates than we had projected in that bond sale. Historically, our spending forecasts have assumed that the legislature would authorize a bonding bill in each year of the forecast horizon. This is the first forecast that no longer holds an assumption about future bonding authorizations. The 2025 legislature clarified that MMB should not make an assumption about future bonding bills, and this resulted in budget savings that were tracked at the end of session. What this means is that during the legislative session, future bonding bills will have a cost, the full cost of debt service will need to be tracked against the general fund bottom line. So you can see the next line, all other areas of the state budget are relatively unchanged from previous estimates. I'd like to discuss carry forward briefly before we move on and explain what it is and how it affects the bottom line. Previous slide, please. Thanks. So in general, appropriations have to be spent within a fiscal year or a biennium, depending on what they're for. But sometimes appropriations are given extended timeframes to be spent by the legislature. And when something is unspent in one period and then rolls into another period, that's referred to as carry forward. And appropriation carry forward is neutral to the general fund bottom line because it's reflected in our numbers as savings in 24-25 and higher spending in 26-27, but they are equal amounts and so they wash each other out. But they do make the spending story a little more complicated, so we wanted to spend a little time here. Appropriation carry forward shows up in every budget forecast. This isn't new, but what's new is the magnitude. And the reason that this is so much higher this year is because the 2023 and 2024 legislatures made significant one-time investments. You know, these were sort of in the spirit of some of the significant one-time nature of the surplus we had at the time. One-time spending investments allowed for sort of greater financial stability over time. But in recognition of the size of these appropriations and the time required to implement them, the legislature just gave agencies a little more time. Some examples of programs included in this number are some transportation and transit projects, lead service lines, and improvement to state outdoor recreation facilities. I'd also remind you, if you look on the next line, that our forecast continues to include an estimate of discretionary inflation. Now we are only seeing it in 28-29 because that's a biennium where we don't have an enacted budget. We estimate this to be $935 million, which is slightly higher than end of session due to a incremental change in the CPI forecast. This number is meant to be a guide for policymakers about the cost of funding government as prices grow. But it's important to emphasize this does not automatically flow to programs. The legislature needs to appropriate it. Now we can move on and dive into the largest driver of the spending forecast, the state's medical assistance program. So this chart displays changes to the MA forecast since the end of session. The solid line on top represents the current forecast, and the dashed line in the bottom shows where we were at the end of session. The shaded areas, the green and blue between the lines, represent higher general fund costs reflected in today's forecast. The value of those shaded areas from 2025 to 2029 is about $2.5 billion, with about $1.3 billion in the first biennium and $1.2 billion in the second. The largest changes in this forecast, compared to where we were at the end of session, are for basic healthcare services. These changes are represented by the teal in the chart. These are the things that, these are services someone might receive to treat an illness or an injury, and they're distinct from long-term care services or services some might receive in a nursing facility or home and community-based setting. In total, basic care spending is projected to be about $1 billion higher per biennium than we projected at the end of session. We have observed increases in the number of people being served as well as the average cost per person. The largest single impact comes from higher than previously assumed rates that we pay to managed care organizations. But we are also observing higher costs for services that are paid on a fee-for-service basis, places where states pay providers directly without going through a managed care organization. And as I mentioned, enrollment is also above previous projections. But spending on long-term care services is also higher than previous estimates, represented by the green portion of the chart. Higher enrollment and cost increases in disability waiver services increase projected general fund spending by $300 million per biennia relative to end of session estimates. So we can move on and talk about the largest item, which is the increase in managed care rates. So updates to managed care rates account for $742 million of the spending change in the first biennium and $834 million in the second. Managed care is how most individuals on medical assistance access their basic health care services. The state provides monthly payments, referred to as capitation payments, to health plans to cover services for enrollees. Every year, the Department of Human Services works with actuaries to set rates for the upcoming year based on past experience and projected growth trends. During calendar year 2024 and 2025, managed care organizations experienced higher than expected costs, and this resulted in 2 increases to 2025 rates in the middle of the calendar year. Generally, these increases happen sort of at the start of every calendar year. These increases resulted in substantially higher capitation payments compared to what was assumed at the end of session across the forecast horizon. The table on the slide shows the impact of these adjustments. So what the percentage represents is how much higher those 2026 rates are per person compared to what we thought 2026 would be in end of session numbers. While the largest percentage difference is in adults without kids at 28%, the impact to the state budget is muted because that group has 90% federal funding. Sort of conversely, the smallest percentage change for families with kids is only 8%, but that is the largest budgetary impact because this group represents about 2/3 of our MA enrollees. Actuaries attribute about 3/4 of this change to increased use of services and 1/4 to the fact that some services are getting more expensive. The one notable exception is that pharmacy growth, where increased use of high-cost drugs is the primary driver of growth. It's really important to note that this cost growth is not unique to medical assistance, and it's also not unique to Minnesota. Within Minnesota, individual marketplace plans are growing on average 22% from 2025 to 2026, and the state employee health plan is experiencing a 17% increase from 2025 to 2026. Similarly, a recent survey done by the Kaiser Family Foundation of state Medicaid programs reported that at least 19 states are implementing some sort of mid-year rate adjustment for their Medicaid managed care rates in 2025, largely increases to their capitation rates to respond to rising acuity among their population. So these changes are clearly a significant part of the budget story. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Campbell to present our budget outlook.
Thank you, Ahna. This slide shows a long-term budget outlook. It compares our forecast revenues against our estimated spending for the current biennium and the next, and that's without including any unspent projected balances or transfers to the budget reserve. It's what we refer to as our structural balance. As you can see, forecast revenues of $66.2 billion in the current biennium are expected to grow by 1.5% in the next, an annualized growth rate of 1.2%. Want to emphasize here that revenues are still growing, but at a slower pace than we had anticipated. During the same time period, we're expecting baseline spending of $68.4 billion to increase by $3.8 billion, or 2.8% on an annualized basis. If you were to include appropriation carry forward and discretionary inflation, total spending would be projected to grow 2.1% on average annually. So bigger picture, if we subtract the total forecasted spending in the planning biennium from expected revenues for that period, you end up with a structural imbalance of $5.4 billion. It would be $4.5 billion if we did not count discretionary inflation. You can see on this slide how our budget reserve has grown over the years, thanks to our nation-leading reserve policy. With the addition of $244 million, our cash flow and budget reserves have hit a record high of $3.8 billion. Those reserve dollars do not only protect us against an unexpected loss of revenue in the current biennium, they also help us to maintain our AAA bond ratings and our reputation as a financially well-managed state. So as we close out the presentation here, I would just say that despite a persistent structural imbalance, we are in good shape in the current biennium. We expect to end it with $2.5 billion on the bottom line, and again, that carries forward to the planning years, reducing the projected negative balance for FY28 and 29. Looking into the planning years, we're currently expecting a nearly $3 billion negative balance that will need to be addressed in the next 2 legislative sessions. Fortunately, policymakers have demonstrated a willingness to make hard choices, and this remains a solvable problem. And there are several indicators pointing in our favor as we move forward. Again, we have a nation-leading automatic allocation to our reserve, and that means that we've got the funds to address an unexpected revenue shortfall should one occur. It's worth noting that we do not anticipate needing to tap into the reserve at this time. Our AAA bond ratings demonstrate the rating agency's continued confidence in Minnesota's responsible financial management and our history of taking action to keep the state on sound financial footing. As a reminder, Minnesota is one of only 16 states nationwide that currently hold this rating. Policy changes at the federal level, while concerning and even devastating for some Minnesotans, so far have not had as large an impact on Minnesota's state budget as we worried that they could have back in February. And because our forecasts project into the planning years, the governor and legislature have what they might need most to turn the projected FY28 and 29 negative balance into a surplus, and that's time. The FY28 and 29 budget does not need to be enacted for at least 18 months. In that time, they've got the time that they need to address the remaining projected FY28 and 29 negative balance and align revenues with spending to keep Minnesota's fiscal house in order. And that's all really good news because today's forecast does make this a harder problem to solve. There will certainly be difficult decisions ahead as policymakers assess their priorities. As always, MMB will continue to watch for significant changes through our monthly revenue updates, our quarterly economic updates, and our close monitoring of federal actions, providing information legislators need to anticipate and respond to economic changes. And with that, we'll be happy to take your questions.
So
Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned persistent structural imbalances.
Speak up a little.
Persistent structural imbalances you mentioned a few minutes ago. You've seen those over the last couple of years. Does that worry you? Is this a reflection of choices made here by policymakers or greater things outside there?
It's a combination of both of those things, and I do think it's worrisome in so much as our ability to weather those structural imbalances has been impacted by the fact that we've been able to carry forward. There have been good decisions by legislators to leave quite a lot of money on the bottom line, and we've been able to carry forward significant resources from one biennium to the next, and that's really blunted the impact of those structural imbalances. But at some point that will catch up with us, and that looks to be in the next biennium, FY28 and 29. And because we're required to have a balanced budget at that time, we will need to have addressed the structural imbalance by that time.
I heard the phrase federal impact several times. You've been here for a while. Can you give us some context? Is there more federal impact on this forecast than what you've seen in recent years?
There probably is more of an impact. I would say it is, you remember in February, we were concerned that it could be a much greater risk than it has been so far. I certainly do think you see the impacts of tariffs. You see the impact of some of the impacts on health care and Medicaid spending, in particular if you look at some of the other funds like the Healthcare Access Fund. And then, of course, the broader economic trends that are happening as a result of some of those actions.
to what extent would you say, the bill that Congress passed this summer is impacting the healthcare costs? Because we heard Director Minge talking about how that's the largest growth since session.
I might turn that over to Ahna to answer that question.
So the question is, to what extent did the HR 1, the Federal Reconciliation Bill, impact the healthcare costs that we've talked about today? I would say, in general, the managed care costs and some of these higher per person cost trends that we're observing are not the results of the Federal Reconciliation Bill. However, there are some other changes, particularly around eligibility and retroactive coverage, that have contributed to those, some of the incremental costs in the basic care space, and we can follow up with the exact numbers, but it's a relatively small portion of the change we saw today.
Follow-up question. Can you speak a little bit more into why managed care costs are higher than expected?
Yep. So managed care costs are higher than expected. So in general, when DHS is working with actuaries to set their rates for the coming year, they're using, if you think about 2025, they had the data from 2023 and then part of the year of 2024. But they don't have complete data because you're always working a little bit ahead and there's always a little bit of a lag. And what we saw is that costs in 2024 and early 2025 far exceeded what actuaries projected. In general, about 3/4 of the growth that we saw is due to higher utilization of services, and about 1/4 is due to some of the services being higher cost. In one space, but in particular, pharmacy costs are driven by increased use of high-cost drugs.
When you say high-cost drugs, do you mean like GLP-1s? And then is there a kinds of care? When you say increased requests for care, like is it surgeries, is it kits, or is it other things that it's driving? We don't know.
So with the kinds of drugs, GLP-1s are certainly a large part of the story, but I don't think that they are the entirety of the story. I know we talked about GLP-1s, in previous forecasts specifically. With the specific, some of the places where we're seeing some of the highest utilization changes are things like outpatient hospital and professional services, which is sort of like physician visits and other sorts of professional services.
Just a question going back to the idea of carry forward, more of a clarifying question here. Can you explain why, if that's from bills passed in 23, 24, that's just showing up in the forecast now, and that wasn't in previous budget forecast cycles?
It's a great question. So carry forward was in all of our previous estimates, but in previous forecasts, it was spending in 24, 25. And then if you dig into our numbers, you'll see 24, 25 shows 1.859 billion in savings from not spending that, and then that shows up at 1.859 billion in spending. So they totally offset each other. They're just showing up in different years.
Why would that show up in the session forecast?
So it was not in the end of session forecast because we hadn't closed the biennium yet and we didn't know that the money wasn't spent. But this was reported in October. We published a biennium close report, and we did sort of report on that at that time.
Do you have any way of knowing if fraud contributed to the rise of costs in DHS programs? Is there any data or any visibility you have to shed light on what effect, if any, that is having on the budget?
I'll let the commissioner do.
Sure. So as Director Minge has said, the healthcare costs that we see rising are largely driven by medical assistance. And that is on trend with what we are seeing in a number of other states and a number of other markets. There's also the increase in long-term care waivers. That is a trend that we've seen over time and talked a lot about in the past. So in terms of what's driving the increase in this forecast, I would not attribute it to fraud.
Did you account for fraud? Are there any numbers? I never saw the word. I never saw a dollar amount. Politically, we've seen $1 billion attached to it. Was there any accounting for it?
So our forecast is based on current law, and that includes some programs that are susceptible to fraud, but of course we would never forecast fraud. We would never include that in the forecast. And as you know, the Department of Human Services, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension are working very diligently to find and address fraud in state programs.
Is there any downward projection, though, in the spending in health and human services based on interventions that have been implemented for fraud?
Yeah, there actually are. Thank you for that question. The Housing Stabilization Services Program is no longer forecasted in this forecast because it has been suspended due to federal action.
Does money that has been defrauded from the state show up anywhere in the forecast monetarily?
No, I don't believe it does.
Like, is that from forecast to forecast, you know, that money goes somewhere. So does the state, I guess, sort of, I don't know, where does that money come from when the state loses that money, if that makes sense?
What I think, I'll try to answer the question I think you're asking. To the extent that it's driving spending increases, it would show up in the increased spending in forecasts.
So is it just being accounted for as spending, not specifically as a line item of fraud?
Correct.
But just to be clear, spending forecasts are dependent on previous spending, some of which is fraudulent. And that is, you guys aren't like, there's no like, you're not able to like parse out which part is forecasted from fraudulent spending in the past. Is that?
Yeah, we would, this is a current law forecast. It is inclusive of all current state law programs and based on spending trends. Ahna might know if there are any corrections that take place, which I think is what you're asking about.
Yeah, because past spending trends we've seen include some fraud.
Just the Housing Stabilization Services.
But like, for example, current investigations into other disability services, that's not.
That would not show up here yet.
Can you explain how you guys project cannabis tax revenue, especially, I'm thinking about the hemp-derived tax revenue potentially going away next year?
I know I can't, but perhaps Director Minge can.
Someone who made my binder knew someone would ask this question. So I think folks are generally aware that lower potency hemp and hemp-derived projects were recently decontrolled federally in 2018, but will be recontrolled in late 2026. Our current forecast does not account for impacts for recontrolling hemp, but we'll update those changes or make those changes and assumptions in the February 2026 forecast. One place where we know it will, so cannabis tax revenue will likely have some sort of impact due to the limited retail, but there might be an offset due to increased sale of other cannabis products. We know there will probably be an impact on licensing because some of these businesses do generate licensing revenue for the state, but the short answer is we don't have those impacts reflected here, and we would look for them in February.
I just have a clarifying question on the bonding element. So when do you know how, like why the bond sale was smaller than anticipated? Is there like a reason or explanation for that? And two, just to clarify, if you're not assuming a bonding bill in this forecast, that means if legislators did do a bonding bill, there would be added expenses in the next 2-year budget because of the debt service, right? So the expenditure side would grow if they do a bonding that's not reflected here.
Right. So to the second question, that's right, that this is the full cost of the GO debt service will need to be paid for in the legislative session as a part of sort of target negotiations. The size of the bonding bill, we always, in a forecast, sort of make an estimate of how many bonds we will sell, and that was in February. But by August, when we were issuing the debt, we just had better cash flow from agencies about how much debt they needed at the time, because we don't like to sell bonds if our agencies and local partners aren't ready to use them. They've still been authorized. We're just waiting to sell them for when they'll actually be.
So maybe projects aren't ready to break ground yet, or that sort of.
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
Can one of you comment about your level of concern around the delinquent credit card balances? It seems to be growing.
Perhaps Dr. Becker would like to speak to that, but I think that the concern there is really about the impact on consumer spending and the impact on the economy of limited consumer growth. Do you want to say anything else?
Yes, I'll echo what the Commissioner said. The delinquency rates are a concern insofar as higher delinquency rates might cause consumers to pull back on expenditures, which would have an effect on the state's economy in general, possibly on sales tax revenue as well. But I'd also like to point out that while delinquency rates on credit cards and some other loans have gone up recently, we're nowhere near the levels we saw during the Great Recession. And so it's something that bears watching, but I don't think it's reached the point of real concern right now. But certainly we'll keep an eye on it.